Good afternoon, everyone. This is Diana with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Transgender Youth, How Family Involvement Supports Mental Health. Research indicates transgender youth experience mental health problems at higher rates. This information, along with risk factors for mental health concerns, was the focus of Transgender Youth and Mental Health, a webinar presented by Dr. Katz Weiss. I invite you to our website, www.ctacny.org, to review this offering. However, in today's follow-up webinar, the importance of supportive family involvement as a protective factor for transgender youth mental health concerns will be reviewed. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the host who will be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation utilizing the chat box feature, which is located on the right of your screen. If it is not visible, click the dialog bubble on the toolbox at the very bottom of your screen, and it should appear. In order to ensure that we are able to answer as many questions as time permits, we are requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will address them during the Q&A portion. For today's webinar, we are very excited to have two co-presenters. Dr. Sabra Katz-Weiss, an assistant professor at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, as well as a developmental psychologist, and Karen Fuller, a credentialed family peer advocate at the Q Center at AACR Health. Once again, thank you for joining us, and I will now pass it along to Sabra to get us started.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Sabra Katz-Weiss, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm an assistant professor in adolescent young adult medicine at Boston Children's Hospital and in pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. And I'm an instructor in social and behavioral sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. My research focuses on sexual orientation and gender identity development, LGBTQ health, and families with transgender youth. I'm currently working on the Trans Teen and Family Narratives Project, which I'll tell you a little bit more about today. And I'm also involved in advocacy at Boston Children's Hospital to improve care for LGBTQ youth and families, and at Harvard Medical School to improve medical education related to LGBTQ health. And I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. Today I'm presenting with Karen Fuller, and I'll let her introduce herself, and then we'll get started on presenting some content.
Hello, I'm Karen Fuller, she, her, hers. I'm a credentialed family peer advocate that works at the Q Center in Syracuse, which is an LGBTQ youth center. As a family peer advocate, my focus is specifically on working with families of LGBTQ youth, and more specifically with families of trans and non-binary youth. I've run several support groups in Syracuse and surrounding areas. In addition, I meet with families one-on-one to provide education, assess for needed supports, link families to appropriate medical, mental health, and legal providers, and provide advocacy for support in schools. I'm the parent of 3 children, one of which is transgender, and began his transition from being assigned female at birth to male at age 7 and is now 19. I have a 16-year-old that identifies as pansexual.
Great, thanks so much, Karen. So to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're hoping to cover, we'll first provide a brief overview of mental health concerns among transgender youth and family support as a protective factor. Then we will review the impact of having a transgender youth on the larger family system. We'll share some examples from families of struggles and successes in supporting transgender youth. And then finally, we'll discuss some implications for mental health practice with transgender youth. And I'll be presenting largely during the first part of the presentation, and then I'll turn it over to Karen, but we'll be switching back and forth a little bit as well during that time. So I want to just begin by briefly acknowledging the different funders and organizations and people who support my research, and especially the study participants who contributed some of the data and stories that I'm going to share with you today. So this first section, mental health concerns among transgender youth and family support as a protective factor, will be a brief refresher from the last webinar that I presented last month on trans youth and mental health. And then we'll talk specifically about the impact on the family. So a growing body of research at this point has indicated that compared to cisgender youth, transgender youth have higher rates of a number of different mental health concerns and risk behaviors. And these include depression, anxiety, suicidality, both ideation and attempt, self-harm, the use of inpatient and outpatient mental health services, as well as substance use and risky sexual behaviors, such as not using condoms or having many sexual partners. A recent study of mental health among 360 transgender and cisgender youth from an urban community health center found that transgender youth had significantly higher rates of depression diagnosis, anxiety diagnosis, suicide ideation, suicide attempt, and self-harm. And notably in this sample, around 50% or half of the youth who were transgender had a depression diagnosis. So the rates are quite high in this group. The mental health concerns and risk behaviors that have been found among transgender youth have largely been attributed to a combination of gender minority stress and a lack of family support and connectedness. Minority stress theory proposes that stressors that are external to a person or distal, such as experiences of prejudice and discrimination, and stressors that are more proximal or closer to a person, such as the internalization of stigma, adversely affect both physical health and psychological health, in part via a psychological stress response. And this theory has been specifically applied to the experiences of gender minority or transgender individuals, such that experiences of anti-transgender prejudice and discrimination and internalized transphobia adversely affect physical and mental health. And we can also think about how other forms of stress, such as racism, classism, homophobia, and biphobia, and the internalized versions of these also play into an individual's experiences to adversely affect their health. Findings from the 2015 GLSEN National School Climate Survey of over 10,000 students found that transgender youth reported high rates of discrimination in schools. So 65% reported verbal harassment, 25% reported physical harassment, 12% reported physical assault, 75% felt unsafe at school, and 70% reported avoiding bathrooms when they were at school, and 56% reported avoiding locker rooms. In terms of family experiences, findings from the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey with adults found that 8 to 18% reported negative family experiences, including having an unsupportive family, experiencing family violence, being kicked out of the home, and running away from home. But findings from that same survey and from the 2017 Canadian Trans Youth Health Survey with youth found that 64% of transgender youth reported feeling safe at home, and that 60% of transgender adults reported having a supportive family. So not all experiences with family are negative for transgender individuals. Families can be especially protective for transgender youth's mental health. Previous research has found that socially transitioned transgender children who are supported in their gender identities have normative levels of depression compared to non-transgender youth. This research has found that parental support is associated with higher life satisfaction, a lower perceived burden of being transgender, fewer depressive symptoms, and less suicidality among transgender adolescents. And some of my own work has found that transgender youth with higher levels of family support and connectedness with family report better health outcomes. So this brings us to the first study that I want to talk about a little bit today and share some findings with you about the protective role of family from the Trans Teen and Family Narratives Project. The sample for this project included 33 families representing 96 family members with transgender adolescents ages 13 to 17, cisgender caregivers, and cisgender siblings, and they represented a range of gender identities. The sample was primarily white race ethnicity, and 40% of the caregivers had a graduate degree. And participants were recruited from multiple sources across New England to obtain a diverse range of experiences. The study design used a community engagement approach such that the community was involved in each step of the research process, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more during the Q&A if you're interested. We conducted qualitative interviews and surveys with each family member every 6 months across 2 years. And the primary research questions that I'm going to talk about today were, what is the mental health of transgender youth in a community-based sample of families? And how is family functioning associated with transgender youth's mental health? So in this study, we asked both the youth themselves about their mental health, and we also asked caregivers about mental health diagnoses of their transgender youth. The transgender youth in this sample reported that 30% of them had had suicidal thoughts, 24% had had a suicide plan, 15% had actually attempted suicide, 49% reported self-harming, and 61% had a clinically significant depression score on the scale that we used to assess depressive symptoms. The caregivers in this study reported that 17% had a youth with a self-injury disorder diagnosis, 40% had a youth with a depression disorder diagnosis, and 48% had a youth with an anxiety disorder diagnosis. We also found that transgender youth who reported better family communication and higher family satisfaction had better mental health outcomes, specifically lower depressive and anxious symptoms and higher self-esteem and resiliency and less self-harm for youth who reported higher family satisfaction. And notably, caregivers and siblings' reports of family functioning were not significantly related to trans youth's mental health. So it was only the youth's own perception of family functioning that was related to their mental health. So this has some implications for who you ask in the family about what's going on and how that might be affecting the trans youth's own mental health. Some of the takeaway points from this study are that transgender youth in this sample had quite an alarming rate of mental health concerns. I was quite surprised, actually, because the families in this study did have a baseline level of support such that they were supportive enough to participate in research together because they had to be in the study together. So yet the youth in this sample still had quite high rates of mental health concerns. But we did find that better family functioning from the transgender youth's perspective was associated with better mental health outcomes among transgender youth, which speaks to the protective role of family. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the impact of having a transgender youth on the larger family system. So kind of thinking beyond the individual transgender youth themselves and thinking about what's happening in the larger family system. And I want to talk briefly first about family systems theory. This theory proposes that family members are interdependent, that individual experiences must be considered within the functioning of the larger family system, and that a transition for one family member challenges the entire family system. And when this theory was first proposed, it was not really proposed with transgender youth in mind. People weren't really thinking about transgender youth very much in the 80s. But I think that is quite applicable to thinking about families with transgender youth in thinking about how a youth's gender transition, even though they are the ones experiencing it themselves, it still affects the entire family. And we can also think about how the family context is itself nested within these other contexts, the community context, the societal historical context, and that the individual is nested within all of those contexts as well. So all of these different factors, contextual factors, may be affecting what's happening both with the individual youth as well as for other family members. Now I'm going to share some findings with you about the impact of having a transgender youth on the larger family system from another study that I did with families with transgender youth, the Trans Youth Family Study. This sample included 20 families representing 54 family members. It included transgender youth with a wider age range, so they were ages 7 to 18 years. They included both children and adolescents, and cisgender caregivers. The sample was primarily white race ethnicity again, and similarly to the Trans Teen and Family Narratives Project, 38% of the caregivers in this sample had a graduate degree. So it was a higher education level. This study was a little bit different. It was a multi-site study, so rather than just being from the New England region, participants in this study were recruited from support networks in the northeastern, midwestern, and southern U.S. In this study, we also did qualitative interviews and surveys with each family member. We just did them twice across 6 months. And the research question that I want to focus on today was, how do trans youth and caregivers describe their relationships within the family? So just thinking about the findings from the interviews to address this research question. So we identified different themes from the interview transcripts related to the youth-caregiver relationship, the caregiver-caregiver relationship in families in which there were two caregivers participating, and then also some of the contextual factors that were happening outside of the family but affecting the family. So I'm going to talk first about the youth-caregiver relationship themes, and these were closeness, movement to acceptance, and conflict. And I'll talk about each of them a little bit more and give you some quotes to illustrate them as well. So the first theme was closeness, and this was a theme across a majority of the interviews where youth and caregivers alike described the youth's gender identity development as a catalyst for closer, more communicative relationships. However, some youth described differing levels of closeness with different caregivers. As one 15-year-old trans boy said, "With my mom, I think it's gotten us a little closer because we have deeper conversations and we talk more. But with my dad, it's like there's a mini elephant in the room. Not a huge one, but just a little one." The next theme, movement to acceptance, several caregivers, typically fathers, described a sort of adjustment period after learning about their child's gender identity. One father of an 8-year-old girlish boy talked about renegotiating the gendered context of their relationship. And he said, "I think any parent would have to say there's some level of disappointment. I think you develop expectations of, this is what I want to do with my child. And again, there are stereotypical girl things, there are stereotypical boy things, and wanting to share those with your child. You have to find different things that you can share together. So there's an adjustment period there and probably a continuing adjustment." The third theme within the youth-caregiver relationships was conflict. Participants described conflict in the youth-caregiver relationship arising in contexts in which the caregiver attempted to police the youth's gender presentation, such as around hair or clothes, or restrict their access to gender-affirming services. when caregivers failed to accept the youth's gender identity over time, it ended up causing critical roadblocks in the youth's access to gender-affirming services. One 18-year-old trans boy described this situation, and he said, "People would ask me, 'Oh, are you on testosterone?' And I'd have to explain to them, 'No, my dad doesn't accept my gender identity.'" So briefly, thinking about these first themes within specifically related to the youth-caregiver relationship, I'm going to ask Karen to reflect a little bit from a parent advocate standpoint about what some of these themes might mean.
So much like the quotes that Sabra provided, in my work with families, I've come across the similar stories. And in many families, one parent is more supportive than the other. They get it; they're right there for their kid. And others, parents are not supportive at all. And in others, parents come in totally at a loss as how to feel. A large part of the work I do with these families is focused on getting the parents or caregivers, and the youth on the same page. So an important part of that is providing a place where parents and caregivers can come in and openly process what they're experiencing emotionally, and at the same time supporting them through their process, helping parents and caregivers better understand what their child may be going through emotionally and explaining what it is, what it's like for their child, and helping parents have a better understanding of how their response to their child's transition can impact them, in a positive or negative way.
Great. Thanks so much, Karen. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about themes specifically related to relationships between caregivers and families in which there was more than one caregiver. So the three themes I'm going to talk about are proactivity between caregivers, discordance in parenting, and support. The first theme was proactivity between caregivers. And in families in which the caregivers included mothers and fathers, rather than two mothers, for example, mothers were often more proactive about accessing gender-affirming services for their child compared to fathers. One mother of a trans boy, age 16, explained, "I'm still more proactive. I'm the one who did the name change, went to court. I took him for his Social Security card, so none of that would be done had it been left to my husband. But again, to me, that's just kind of the man-woman thing. I don't know, I just take charge." The second theme was discordance in parenting. Differences in parenting emerged when one caregiver was prepared to affirm the youth's gender identity, while the other caregiver was still adjusting to the identity disclosure. One mother of a gender-fluid boy talked about this discordance in the caregiver-caregiver relationship. She said, "At the time, my husband and I had very different ideas on how to raise a child like this. It was one opinion against another opinion, as easy as that. That became very troublesome for many different reasons. We weren't giving each other support because we didn't believe what the other one thought we should do, and so we were at constant odds about how to even address a child like this." And the last theme that I want to talk about with caregiver-caregiver relationships was support. Although there was a certain degree of discordance between caregivers, caregivers also relied on each other for support, especially when disclosing their child's gender identity to other people. One mother of an 8-year-old trans girl recalled, "We would be going to see my family and I would be freaking out. I'd get real stressed out and worried, like, what is this going to be like? How is this going to go? And that's where my husband would come and support me and help me through it and try to see my way through it." So I'm going to pause again here and let Karen reflect on some of the caregiver-caregiver themes before we move on.
So again, like in the examples provided, I've worked with many parents who clearly have separate ideas about how to best support their child. Making sure that both parents are heard and are able to express openly exactly where they each are in their own separate process is very important. And ensuring that they both understand that each of their feelings are valid and that the focus is on their child. They both love their child, they want what's best for them. So it's important that they understand where each other is coming from. And though at the start, one parent may take the lead and do more of the footwork while the other parent is off in the background, the parent that's off in the background soon comes around and oftentimes will take the ball and give the other parent a break and take the lead on things maybe the other parent may have more difficulty with. And an example in my personal life with that would be very early in my child's transition, my child always wore boys' clothing. And one of the first things he asked once we knew he was trans was he wanted a haircut. For me, that was the most difficult part not because I didn't support him, but it was like he's wearing boys' clothes. People are going to ask me. He's not out to everybody. They're going to want to know what's going on with this kid. And thankfully, my husband, who's usually more in the background, took the lead on that and took him for the haircut. So it's very important that parents are able to process their own feelings in order to then come together and be each other's support in order to ultimately be the best support for their child.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So the last set of themes that I want to talk about were related to contextual factors outside of the family that affected relationships within the family. And the three themes I want to talk about here were school, extended family, and religion. Schools often played a critical role in family relationships, both in terms of offering support, but also offering some challenges for these families. One father of a trans boy, age 18 years, said, thinking about the school, they were really supportive. And I think, that helped a lot, even in the first month or two. They just set the tone, I think. Alternatively, in contrast, a mother of a trans girl, age 11 years, said, we offered a lot of professionals to come to the school and offered things to other parents if they were curious. We offered things to the teachers, and our school was just absolutely not supportive in that. Relationships with extended family was the next quote, and these relationships also played a role in relationships within the family. One mother of an 8-year-old girlish boy described a fight that she had with her own father, the child's grandfather, about her child's gender identity. She said, my dad said, I just don't understand. At what point are you going to make him play with gender-appropriate toys? So I just lost it, and I just said, this is who he is, this is what he likes to play with, and I'm not going to tell him that it's wrong. My husband said to me, I've never heard you yell at anyone like that. I've never seen you have a fight. It was the biggest fight of my life. And the last contextual factor that I want to talk about briefly is the factor of religion. Religion can be, both a positive influence or a negative influence or factor in the lives of families with trans youth. Several trans youth in this study identified religion as an influence in their lives. For one 17-year-old trans boy, his religious community provided support after the social transition to his gender identity. Recalling a positive experience at weekend conferences with his faith community, he said, the kids that go to them, they kind of practice radical acceptance. Oh my gosh, you're different. That's the best thing ever. So I'm going to pause here again to let Karen reflect on some of the contextual factors themes.
The next step often in my work with families after getting parents and caregivers on the same page as their youth is helping parents and caregivers navigate these various factors. So often parents ask, how do I handle telling extended family? What about my church? I'm from a very religious background. How will my child be received by their peers and teachers? Thankfully, in today's world, more people are aware of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. And many times in these situations, they can find more support than they thought they would. However, there's still times in these situations that can cause a huge strain on families. Uh, the worry alone about how to handle these situations can bring the transition process to a halt, which I'll speak more about a little later. It is important to be honest with families that they may have to, lose family members and friends, or they may have to find another religious community, or battle it out with the school, or even change schools. However, they also need to hear that they will find other family and friends, and that there are accepting religious communities, and that schools are becoming better educated in supporting trans and gender nonconforming students, and reminding them that they are doing the right thing in supporting their child and giving them examples of others who have been through similar struggles but have had a positive outcome. Another part of the work I do is to advocate for these families in schools and helping school personnel have a better understanding of why these kids need their support. For us, another little bit of personal information in our journey was the school, I think, had a huge part in how smoothly my son's transition went. I was really scared about addressing it with the school, but the principal had our back. And knowing that the principal was there for us helped my husband and I feel a sense of relief, but also allowed my son to, progress and gain confidence in himself because he knew if he had any trouble with any students or teachers, if he went to the principal, she would handle the situation. So it really does make a difference.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So some of the takeaway points from the Trans Youth Family Study findings that I presented are really that family relationships are quite complex with differing levels of closeness and conflict among different family members. Contextual factors from outside the family affect relationships within the family, so we can't think about families as being in this bubble. And the themes really highlighted the importance of healthy relationships among family members for trans youth's well-being. So now we're going to transition to talking about some more examples from families of struggles and successes in supporting transgender youth. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen for this section.
Okay. So as soon as a parent finds out they're expecting, they wonder and are often asked, boy or girl. Today, more and more parents are learning that the gender assigned to their child at birth is not the gender they identify with. As a parent, what do you do when your child comes to you saying they identify as the opposite gender they were assigned or someplace in between? As parents, we have the best interest of our children at heart. But when faced with something as life changing as having your child reveal they don't align with their assigned gender, it's very difficult to know what to do. Parents start to question what we may have done wrong, either in the pregnancy or in raising our child. We worry what others will think. We worry about our child's future. Will they be safe, happy, find love, be accepted? Then, on top of all the worry, there's the mourning process. We have to cope with the future we dreamed of for our children changing. The dream of walking our daughter down the aisle or our son getting their first sports car changes, and it's very difficult for many parents to cope with, especially when they feel so alone. So, as a remedy for this, um, it's important to support the entire family. Understand what parents may be experiencing. And a lot of the resistance in supporting their child comes from fear. So it's important to keep in mind that parents have these questions come up, whether or not they are supportive right off the bat. And a lot of their resistance to supporting their child when first learning that their child is trans or non binary comes from the fears they have around these questions. And therefore, it's important providers understand what is happening for the parents and other family members in order to help them process through this. Parents may need some education around the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. So explaining what step, oh, so um, ex, so again, a lot of families do not, get that they're two different things. So some discussion around that is important. Parents and other family members need a place that they can go to for support. So parents and family members benefit from having a place that they can go to share what they are going through, especially early on in their child's transition. They need a place they can go to empty the box, let out all their fears and frustrations so that they can rearm themselves and be their child's best advocate. In addition, siblings of trans youth need a place they can express what they're going through, especially dealing with school and their peers, and the fact that their parents' focus will shift to the youth that is transitioning. And when families feel supported, they gain confidence and they are doing what's right for their child, and therefore they are better able to support their child through the transition. Another important factor is communication. Parents and families should be encouraged to maintain open lines of communication with each other. A lot of the answers to the questions parents have will be coming from the youth themselves. So it's important to encourage open communication. Parents should understand that the first person they should look to for how transition is to proceed is their child. Parents and youth need to be on the same page in order for transition to move forward smoothly. Often, once coming out to their parents, youth are off and running. Coming out for them is a relief, and once they come out, if their parents' response is not altogether negative, they're ready to move on quickly. And it's important for providers to work to bring both parents and youth together. Youth often have known how they've felt for years and can see it as their parents are not being supported because they're not moving as fast. Youth have to understand their parents are going to need time to process, and parents are going to need to understand why their children are eager to move forward at a speed that to the parents will seem too fast. And parents need to understand that it's not a phase or the latest trend. Their children are not confused when their children comes out as a teen or later. And providers can help parents better understand the reasons why youth may not come out until their teens or later. Often youth know that they feel different, however, they don't have a name for it. Often they will identify their sexuality first, thinking that must be it because that's what they hear and know. But after learning more, whether it be through attending support groups or doing their own research, they then find the words to better identify how they feel. So parents, mistake this for meaning their child is just changing their mind when they are really just trying to figure out who they are. Stuck in transition. So providers should be aware if a family is supportive but there's no progress in the transition, the family might be stuck. Parents and families need to be encouraged to get help to process through their child's transition. So some families start off saying they're 100% supportive, they don't need to mourn, they don't need to process anything. However, you may find that a month or so down the road that things have not progressed, though it's clear with working or speaking to the youth that the youth wishes to go forward. And sometimes parents become stuck because they truly have not processed the fact that their child is transitioning. And the youth being able to tell how their parents feel and not wanting to cause a conflict in the family may just tread water. So signs that this is the case would be the parents are still using the wrong name or pronoun and saying, well, my child is fine with that. or saying their child is fine with just being out at home but not in public, or saying that their child hasn't brought up hormones or surgeries. So, like with the name and pronouns, when youth feel that their parents are not fully on board and they don't want to make waves, they won't make their needs or desires known. However, if this continues, the youth often struggle with high levels of anxiety and continue to struggle with the high levels of anxiety and depression. And this is another reason why communication is so important. And language. Learning a new name and pronoun is difficult, but it's a key part in supporting trans and non-binary youth's mental health. Misgendering and dead naming play a major role in the high suicide rates among trans and non-binary youth. So it is important parents understand that though it's difficult, it is necessary that they work at using the name and pronoun the child chooses because it makes a difference. If you watch any child that is in transition, when a parent uses their new name and the correct pronouns, you can see this light. And this light is a term that a lot of parents use to describe the change in demeanor and attitude in their children when the child feels their gender identity is validated. So when you use the correct name and pronouns, this is one of the first opportunities to see this light or a glimpse of who your child's true self is. Practice makes perfect. So parents and families should be encouraged to practice using their youth's new name and pronouns. Some parents actually practice using the new name and pronouns when the child isn't around, for instance, in the car on the way to work, or in their head while they're washing dishes. They'll have a whole script and kind of just run it through. Some parents say they put it in the phone, but it takes time. And as long as parents are working toward it and really putting in the effort, that's what's important. A lot of times parents will come in and they get all upset because they feel they should get this name really quick. But it does take time, and I just encourage them, to keep working on it. And if you do make a mistake, own it, correct it, apologize, and move on. So keep in mind that your child can tell the difference between someone who is trying and may make an honest mistake to someone who is not really trying or deliberately refusing to use the correct name and pronouns. And moving forward. Though every journey is different, the fact we love our children is number one. Parents that support their child through transition will see positive outcomes. At the start of the journey, it may seem impossible that life will get back to normal or that things can even be better than they were before. But just ask any parent that has supported their child through transition, and you'll learn that it is indeed possible. More often than not, parents see their children flourish in ways they never imagined. A youth who would lock themselves in their room and never socialize are found suddenly spending more time with family or out with friends. Some youth find new interests and get involved in things like drama club or other school activities. Their depression and anxiety are far less, and for some, that may mean a reduction in medications. And if they're supported in school, you may see a student who was struggling before now start to thrive and take pride in their work. Getting support for the entire family is a great benefit to the youth. Again, parent support is a key factor. In order to be that support for their kids, they also need to find support for themselves. Someplace they can go and let everything out where they're not judged and where people understand exactly what they're going through. Encourage parents and families to continue to share their experience. Again, because every journey is different, families should be encouraged to support each other by sharing their experiences. This not only helps the families that are just starting out, but continues to help affirm those further along on their journey. Letting them know they did the right thing in supporting their child and continue to do the right thing supporting their child, and that this experience can be a great help to others. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Sabra.
So Karen did a really nice job talking about some of the ways in which providers can help support families. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about some of the specific implications for mental health practice with transgender youth that we've identified through this presentation. So the first implication for practice is really that a family systems approach is necessary for caring for transgender youth. And this means involving all family members in the care of transgender youth and really supporting youth by providing support to the whole family. And families can be supported specifically through educating them about transgender youth, what it means to be transgender, gender identity development, as well as the actual process of transitioning. And the second major implication for practice is that although the whole family should be involved, it's important to note that the transgender youth's own perception of family functioning is really what's most relevant for their mental health and should be prioritized. So even if the parents think that everything's fine, if you don't actually talk to the youth to discover that they may have a different perception about what's happening, then you may not be able to understand what's happening in terms of the transgender youth's mental health either. And really keep in mind when you're working with families with transgender youth that the transgender youth themselves are the experts about their own experience. So parents can only provide so much insight into what's happening for the youth. They obviously are experts of their own experience as well. So it's really that each family member is an expert about their own experience within the family. We have included here for you in the slides some resources that may be helpful in working for families with transgender youth. And we've also included some resources that are specifically for transgender youth and families. So if you have clients or patients that you're already working with or maybe working with in the future who are transgender youth and families, you can share some of these resources with them. And that brings us to the Q&A. So I'm going to pass it to Diana now, who's going to run this portion of the webinar. Hi, I can see a question through the chat box asking whether I can clarify the term cisgender. Yes, so cisgender means non-transgender. So it refers to people for whom their gender identity is aligned with their sex assigned at birth. So as an example, I was assigned a female sex at birth, and I identify as a woman, so I am a cisgender woman.
What I just took away from my conversation is that everybody would and it would be a trend.
All right, I see another question. I'm just going to read out the question. So as a primary care pediatrician, what is the best way to be an ally or support to families with a transgender child? And are there any practical educational resources for PCPs on working with families through this process? So I hope that we covered some of the ways that you can be an ally or support to families with a transgender child. I think it's really about providing education to these families, listening to each family member's perspective on what's going on, but also sort of keeping the transgender child themselves at the center of the process, ensuring that everyone is sort of listening to what they need and what they would like to see in terms of moving the process forward. And then we did provide some resources at the end that I think are also applicable for primary care pediatricians as well. There's definitely more training is needed in this area. I know that a lot of medical schools don't really address working with transgender patients very much. So that's some of the advocacy work that I'm doing at Harvard Medical School and at the hospital, is to make sure that people are getting more of this training. It looks like another question that we have, how can we learn about appropriate language around this issue? This is a tricky one because language in this area is changing all the time, particularly among youth. Youth are often using different terms to describe their gender identity, and I think one of the best ways that you can learn about it is to ask the youth that you're working with, or the individuals that you're working with, about how they identify and what those terms mean to them. And I don't know if, Karen, do you have anything to add about that question?
Yeah, you can reach out, like the Q Center, we do cultural competency training, so maybe looking out to different organizations that around you that go into schools and businesses and different agencies to do some of these cultural competency trainings. And periodically, people have us back every year with the updates.
Great, thanks. It looks like another question. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll up a little bit. Do you have a good resource for categories such as girlish boy, trans girl, fluid, etc.? It sounds like this attendee may be asking specifically about the non-binary categories, which I think are a little bit newer to some folks and can take a little bit more time to wrap your head around. There's a really great guide like a 1 or 2 page guide to non-binary identities through the American Psychological Association. My contact information is on the last slide, and if you email me, I would be happy to send that to you or anyone else who's interested in seeing it.
Thank you so very much for that.
It looks like another question is, do rates of depression and suicidal ideation decrease after a medical or hormonal transition? From the evidence that I've seen, yes, they do decrease, but they may not decrease to 0 after a transition, because a lot of youth who have transitioned may still be experiencing bullying or other forms of rejection because they're out to more people. potentially after they transition. So those external experiences may still relate to feelings of depression and suicidal ideation. So they definitely get better often, I would say, but they're not, it doesn't really solve the problem necessarily, because we still live in a society in which transgender people are not fully accepted.
Right. And I can agree with that because that's a lot of what I see too. So a lot of the youth do improve, some more than others, but there's definitely less depression and less suicidal ideation after, medical or hormonal transition.
Great, and I do apologize for the technical difficulties. I do appreciate you answering the questions. We still have about a few minutes left for another question or two. So the next question that we have here, what advice can you offer if a parent is still resistant to the youth you are working with change in gender, even after you have provided them education on the importance of supporting their child? So any particular suggestions or recommendations that you have for those practitioners out there?
Karen, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah. So usually, what I say to others is, and I don't know again what areas. If you do have an LGBTQ youth center there, maybe making a connection there. But for us, we're lucky enough that I do have these support groups, and one of the things is just if I can get the parent in the door, if you can connect the parent to another parent, because again, it's about the fears. It's about a lot of this resistance is coming from the fear of what are people going to think, or will my child be safe or happy, or all those questions. So sometimes just having a cup of coffee with another parent or another person going through it and realizing they're not alone can help alleviate some of this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think in a lot of geographic regions, there may not be in-person support groups, although I think PFLAG does a pretty good job, and other organizations like the one that Karen works for, of trying to provide some of these support groups. But if you're in a geographical region where in-person support groups don't exist, there's a lot of support for families online, like through Facebook groups and things like that, where they can get some of that support of connecting with other parents, even if it's not in person.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen and Sabra. Just very quickly, I'm going to try to squeeze in the last question in there. As a primary care pediatrician, what is the best way to be an ally or support to families with a transgender child? And are there any practical or educational resources for primary care physicians or pediatricians on working with families through this process?
I think we already answered that one, but I just want to direct people again to the resource slides that we provided, especially the resources for providers slide, which has, I think, some helpful resources that you can check out.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And again, I do want to thank both you and Karen for answering these questions, and certainly for a great presentation. The slides to this webinar will be up within the next 2 to 3 days, and certainly we'll provide you with the resources that were mentioned for all of you here. And I do hope that you find them to be helpful. I do want to point out that we do have some upcoming events for our CTAC audience members. But again, we have the contact information here for both our presenters, Dr. Katz Weiss, as well as Karen Fuller. We do hope that you have found this webinar very helpful and that you can join us for our upcoming events listed here. Any questions or concerns, certainly feel free to reach out to us via our website at www.ctacny.org. And once again, thank you on behalf of our presenters and the CTAC team. We hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.